Hello, Internet. This is Daniel with Driving and Dragons. And I'm going to come back. I was going to do another EXP to level 3 video on realistic combat. I'll actually do that one a little bit later. It's a nice short one. But I wanted to follow up a bit because Tomb of Horrors is kind of a sticking point. It's kind of a soapbox for me. And I wanted to go back and do a different reaction to a Tomb of Horrors review from Seth Skorkowski. Now, Seth is very well respected throughout the hobby for a lot of reasons. One is because his stuff is pretty spot on. And I don't think he's 100% in line with me when it comes to the Tomb of Horrors, but he's pretty close, and he at least understands what it is, why it exists, and how you can use it. And this is just, once again, I'm using this dungeon and these two reactions as a way to just clearly highlight the fundamental differences between the newer players in the hobby and older players in the hobby. It's not just a matter of a generational gap or age, or these older players are older, so they've grown up and they're more mature. It really is a fundamental difference in their approach to the game, the segment of society that they came from. And you can tell because you take an older game master like Seth, and he instantly has, even though he ran it later in life, he instantly has a better grasp of the tomb than a newer GM like Jacob does. So let's have a look-see. Let's take a look through this. I haven't seen it in a long time, but I do remember that he was in line with me a lot, pretty close. So let's have a look at Seth Skorkowski's review of the Tomb of Horrors.
Today we'll be taking a look at the legendary, the infamous AD&D adventure, The Tomb of Horrors. Written by Gary Gygax, this short 12-page module was originally published by TSR in 1978, and then was updated with additional art in 1981. Second edition gave us a reprinting, and the sequel, Return to the Tomb of Horrors, and the module has been released in 3rd, 4th, and now 5th edition as part of the Tales from the Yawning Portal collection. It's had its own novelization and was also used as a major plot element in the novel Ready Player One, with a blink and you'll miss it reference in the film version. With such a publication history, it shouldn't surprise anyone that it's won accolades and praise and has been listed as one of the greatest dungeons of all time, and it's certainly one of the most challenging. It's also one of the most hated dungeons of all time, loathed by dungeon masters and players alike for more than 4 decades. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, because there are so many different versions over all the different editions of this adventure, the only version that I'm going to discuss is the original AD&D module S1. Yes, most of the information that I'm going to be giving is going to be relevant no matter which edition it is that you're looking at, but for simplicity's sake, we're only going to look at the original module. While it's been out of print for years, the original S1 module is available again as both a PDF and a print version at DriveThruRPG, both of which they sent to me to use for this review, so a huge thank you to them for that. These are both from the 1981 expanded version that contains the illustration booklet, which I consider a must-have for any dungeon master wishing to run this game regardless of which edition it is. The print-on-demand version is very clean, and while it doesn't have the big pull-out, fold-out map that the original version had, the map is still printed inside of it, and it's very easy to read, so I do give the print-on-demand a huge thumbs up. The PDF version does have a few problems. It's an obvious scan with a few dark spots and smudges that are around the edges, and since the text is all photographed, you can't search through anything by text, so that is unfortunate. However, having a printable version of all of the illustration booklet is a huge plus, and I consider the PDF worth it just for that.
Okay, so a couple of key things here. One, obviously, he's doing a full review, so he's actually giving some very good advice there, too. If you run the tomb, the pictures are absolutely 100% necessary because you don't want to screw up and leave out detail. You also don't want to accidentally give hints with the detail. You want to be able to say, hey, here's what you're looking at, and let them think and analyze it and figure stuff out on their own. It is very helpful. And Absolutely got to use the first edition version. Like, even if, the way I see it, even when I run this in 3.5 edition Dungeons and Dragons, I don't use the 3.5 reprint version. I take the S1 module and I adapt it to the 3.5 rule set. There's a reason for that. It's because this dungeon loses a lot of what it is when it gets redone. Because every time these people redo it, even when they try to quote unquote be faithful, like in Tales of the Yawning Portal, they're never really faithful. They always look at it. They always go in. How can we make it better? How can we tweak it? How can we adjust it? This is one of those things that was kind of a masterpiece when it was made.
So any 5th edition Dungeon Masters out there, I feel that the Tales of the Yawning Portal collection sort of shortchanged you by not providing the full list of illustrations that were intended to go with the scenario. So if you do plan on running this adventure using the Tales from the Yawning Portal or any of the later editions, I do suggest that you still pick up the PDF of the original S1. That way you can get the illustration booklet and you can give the players the full experience that this dungeon was originally intending for you to have. Now, over the years, I have run this scenario 3 times with varying levels of success.
What are you talking about? I remember when we beat the Tomb of Horrors. Yeah, that thing was hard, but busting it was one of my proudest accomplishments.
Well, I've got some bad news for you. The only reason that you guys even beat the dungeon was because I toned it down. It would have completely killed you if I hadn't.
You nerfed it? Damn, I thought we did good.
No, you guys did fine. I'm the one that failed you. Over the years, hundreds if not thousands of players have successfully beaten the Tomb of Horrors. However, it's my opinion that most of the people that believe that they have completed the Tomb of Horrors really didn't. It's really they only completed it because the Dungeon Master let them.
There's no harm in doing that. You have done dozens of module reviews where you brought up specific parts to maybe tone it down or give little bits of help to your players.
Oh, that's true, and for most modules, I fully support doing it that way. However, the Tomb of Horrors falls into a special category. This is not a standard dungeon. This is a test.
100% correct. This is why I was saying before, you're not supposed to, you've got to play it with a big poker face. You've got to make sure that you are not ever giving tons and tons of hints. It is a test of the players themselves. And because it's a test of the players themselves, when you help them, when you give them hints, you are dumbing down the test. And that's absolutely correct. It is a failure as a GM when you tone things down, fudge dice. All the stuff that a good game master would normally do in a regular game should not be done in the Tomb. The Tomb of Horrors, I believe, is the only place where the really hardcore bro SR people are correct about rules as written. This has to be run explicitly the way it's written, with no fudging.
In fact, this is the Kobayashi Maru of dungeons. But unlike the Kobayashi Maru of Star Trek, the Tomb of Horrors is actually winnable. But in order for it to work properly, a dungeon master must run this honestly. Gygax originally wrote this module for a spectacular group of players, his own players, including Mage Tenzer of Floating Disc fame. So the foundation for this adventure isn't fortune and glory and all the stuff that normal adventures are based off of. This adventure is based on a challenge, a test. And that's why game masters should approach this adventure differently than all the other modules out there. This scenario is about the players versus Gary Gygax. He is throwing the best that he has against them, and it's up to the players to see if they can beat him. And the Dungeon Master's role in running this adventure is to be an impartial referee.
Bingo. Just like I was saying, and this kind of gives you the reason why, like, say, Jacob has such a problem with this dungeon over at EXP level 3, and why a lot of modern players do. This is a test of the player, not of the characters, of the players. And the DM is not a mutual storyteller, a collaborative effort. He is a referee, like you would be in a war game. He is there to call balls and strikes and nothing else. And this is not normal storytelling tabletop role-playing games. This is a test for the players that is meant to be run explicitly as that. And it's not the DM versus the players, which is what you hear some people say, oh, DM versus player, DM versus player. It's not the dungeon master or the game master versus the players. It is the dungeon itself. It is the author, in this case, Gary Gygax, versus the players. Not DM versus character, dungeon versus player.
I feel that a lot of the disdain that a lot of people have about this scenario is simply because a lot of people don't understand what Tomb of Horrors is. They assume, and understandably so, that this is just a standard, if not difficult, dungeon. But the module warns dungeon masters early on that it's not. The first warning is here, saying that this was a tournament adventure. Now, when I was 13 years old, I mistakenly thought that a tournament game meant that it was like a pro-level game, for big league players that make big league player money. No, a tournament game is a game that's to be played at a tournament or a convention, is meant to be done in only a few hours. And tournament games are notorious meat grinders. Older scenarios or older printed scenarios, and not just for Dungeons and Dragons, but for a lot of older games, were just tournament games that were reskinned and sold as modules. And those were among the most blatantly brutal adventures that were available out there. So now, whenever I see an adventure that says that it was a tournament game or used at this convention, I know a little bit more of what to expect from it. Now, the second warning is here. Gygax opens the module with a note saying that this is a thinking person's game. And if your players are high combat players, they will be unhappy with it, and it's best to skip this adventure altogether. So, if your players are top-notch, and not just the characters, but the players, and they're the type of people that enjoy a good thinking person's game and would want to try their skills out against Gygax, then and only then should a dungeon master even attempt to run Tomb of Horrors. There are a lot of other modules out there that you could play instead if this is not what's going to be suited for you, so there is no need to run the players through this unless they meet all of the proper qualifiers in order to go through it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to offer my tips and my criticisms and my suggestions and interpretations as a dungeon master who has run this adventure. But before we go any further, I must warn you that there will be spoilers. So any players in the audience, if you've never played this adventure, please stop here. But if what I've described interests you, please send your dungeon master this way to see if Tomb of Horrors might be right for you. But if you go any further, you're going to only be cheating yourself. Okay.
I'm going to stop this for just 1 second. This is one of the things I really appreciate about Seth's channel is when he does these reviews, he does that nice big, and it doesn't matter what it is, whether it's a cyberpunk adventure or a aliens adventure or whatever it is. He always does that nice little spoiler-free intro that's, fairly lengthy. I mean, he spent 6 minutes talking about the tomb here, and he gives players enough information to determine, hey, do you want to run this? And then he says, hey, go send your dungeon master here if you don't want to spoil yourself. And I really like that. I like the fact that he gives a good amount of information that can inform a player if they want to play it without actually spoiling the adventure for them.
Okay, Dungeon Masters, let's get to work. A lot has been said about Tomb of Horrors over the last 40 years. In fact, I've been planning on doing this review for some time, but the problem that I encountered is what is it that I could possibly say that could add to the discussion that hasn't already been said by 1,000 other people that are far more eloquent than myself. But during the course of my reading and talking to different dungeon masters and players and people that have gone through it, I saw several repeating factors or problems, or at least perceived problems, that I don't agree with about Tomb of Horrors, and I have a few workarounds for those or different interpretations, so that's going to be the focus of my review. I'm not going to be doing a walkthrough or anything like this. This is going to be more of a bullet point review of specific things and different ways to approach them. The first part is just to repeat that this is a test. This is a test by Gary Gygax through the medium of a Sararak the Demilich. Your job as a dungeon master is to be impartial here. And this is evident in one of the lines in the opening of the module, specifically reminding dungeon masters to avoid any vocal tones or facial expressions that might assist the players.
Okay, I want to stop right here for this. This is one of the things that repeatedly came up when I was going through XP for level 3. Trashing the tomb and not understanding it. And I said numerous times, if he'd read the damn module, he'd understand some of this stuff. Look at this excerpt right here. Please read and review all the material herein and become thoroughly familiar with it before beginning the module. He clearly didn't do that because he was confused in the very first room. As players enter keyed areas, you will note the appropriate information on whether or not the area has one or more illustrations for visually highlighting play. Read aloud the appropriate sections, never give additional information, which player characters would have no way of knowing, avoid facial expressions, hints, or blah, blah, blah. You look at this, look through the whole thing. No hints, it could help or mislead players. The enjoyment of the module is managing to cope, and those players who manage to do so even semi-successfully will appreciate you running it down the middle, allowing them to live or die on their own. Very, very clear. When you have somebody who clearly does not read the module, clearly does not make sure they're familiar with it, clearly doesn't know what's going on, and clearly brings in a bias, whether that's a collaborative bias or a bias against into the system, you are going to run it incorrectly, and you're not going to give the players the satisfaction. You don't get satisfaction out of the Tomb of Horrors because your character rolled high and killed the baddie. You get satisfaction out of the Tomb of Horrors because even though everything is stacked against you, you as a player figured it out, and you didn't need help to do it.
This is meant to be run with a severe poker face. If your players want to be able to say that they beat the Tomb of Horrors, they have to earn it. Again, this is a little bit opposite of how I normally look at modules, but this is a different type of module than all the others out there. The next issue is motivation. If this is going to be run with a tournament style where the characters are made specifically for the adventure, then the motivation is clear. They're going into the dungeon because it's there, and that works very easily because there's no real reason given in the module as to why the character should go inside. However, if these characters are not going to be tournament style, if these are beloved characters that have been played for a while and the players have kind of worked them up to the levels appropriate for the Tomb of Horrors, then you're going to need to give them a reason to go inside. And not just a reason to go inside the dungeon, but a reason to stay inside once they get inside the dungeon and they see what it's all about. Now, I feel that players that go inside the Tomb of Horrors should be well aware that they are going inside the Tomb of Horrors, the ultimate dungeon test. But what about their characters? What is their motivation going to be for going through this? The module gives a few partial ideas, ranging from seeking riches to some local baron wants them to clear the land off so he can build a nice summer castle there. But I have two more options to suggest. One, you can make it personal. You could have some beloved NPC or friendly rival of the player characters. They went inside the Tomb of Horrors and they are now presumed to be dead. However, through magic or something like that, it's been determined that that NPC's soul is still alive, though it is in immediate danger, and unless the PCs go inside the Tomb of Horrors to rescue him, this NPC is going to be lost forever, so this is now going to be a rescue mission as far as their motivation. Or two, the player characters are going inside the Tomb of Horrors in order to get a specific artifact, such as that Baron's idiot son, in some misguided attempt to prove himself, stole the Baron's Grand High Poobah sword and charged off into the Tomb of Horrors on his own. And then a few days later, the son emerged from the tomb. He's completely naked and he's insane, or maybe he just doesn't remember what happened inside the tomb. And now the Baron has hired the PCs to go inside and get his sword back. But it also gives them a nice little hint as far as what a possible fate they could have if they go inside the Tomb of Horrors.
Okay. So there's stuff I agree with and stuff I disagree with in this last little bit that he ran through. One, absolutely. They should know beyond the shadow of a doubt that they are going into the Tomb of Horrors. Where I disagree with, though, is that they should not have this is not, I'm very firmly in the camp that the Tomb of Horrors you should not have your beloved characters that you've worked up to the level going into the Tomb of Horrors. It's not for that. It should not be included in a campaign, in a long-running thing. If you're going to run it with characters that the players have already run, it should be done purely as a, hey, we're going to run the Tomb of Horrors. We're going to try it. We're going to try and pass the test. You can use those characters. It has no bearing on their other campaign. It has no bearing on them. None of the stuff they use is gone. None of the stuff they find are they going to get to keep. It's purely a test for you to go in and get it. It should not be used in any other way. So, but while he has some cool stuff to go in there to kind of get the people in there, and they're good things, I don't think that this module should ever be used this way. And really, right off the bat, he's kind of put the lie to his own thing. Hey, the guy coming back with the Grand Poobah sword and everything has hints. He's giving you hints of what could happen to you. And while these hints don't necessarily tip you off to any specific traps or specific problems, and they can be kind of an aha moment, honestly, the tomb is well written enough that it has all the hints and tips you need in the module itself. There's no need to do that. And it kind of, tipping off the players kind of screws them out of the test, in my opinion.
Horrors. Eventually, the player characters will make it to the mound, a bald hill with rocks that give it the resemblance of a grinning skull.
Oh, it's a skull! I thought it was some sort of crappy jack-o'-lantern. A skull makes a lot more sense.
The first hurdle of the tomb is really just finding the entrance. It's a good hurdle, but I've also seen it take an hour or more for players to even find the front door to the Tomb of Horrors. And by the time they found it, they were actually a little bit frustrated and the mood had been deflated somewhat. So my suggestion here is to clearly describe the hill as being bald or barren. There's very little grass. It's mostly lichen. And it's very clear to see that there's not a entrance that's hidden in the front half or in the top half of the hill. Then when they circle around the hill, they're going to see the sandy hill that's on the north face, that's kind of protected by a little overhang, and it's completely shrouded in very dense and very thick vines and shrubs. And this is where they should begin poking and prodding and trying to find an entrance. Once they find it, we get a simple one-page map. It is a very small dungeon, but with a lot inside. If you prefer a prettier map, there's a lot of other ones out there that people have made over the years for various editions. You can Google them and find them quite easily, but they don't offer anything more than the original. Unless you just want to have a prettier map, the original one works fine. 5th edition gave us a beautiful color picture of the opening hall, and while I do like the new art quite a lot, the 1st edition module gave us 31 handouts of specific features to give to your players. Get a copy of this, give them to your players as they reach each point, block out or cut off the corner numbers, that way it doesn't give them any unnecessary hints, but the handout book is very important to running this module. One short, almost throwaway line that a lot of dungeon masters seem to neglect: any characters that go astral or ethereal might attract a type 1 through 4 demon. Now, this just isn't important because certain spells or abilities the player characters can enter the astral etheric plane. This is telling us that the Tomb of Horrors has infested with demons. That's part of the point why in the original cover we see 2 demons grinning like a pair of drunks taking a selfie. This is going to be important later on in this video, but for the time being, don't forget that astral or etheric characters could attract a demon. So let's talk about traps. The Tomb of Horrors is famous for its traps, and there are certainly some old reliables, like pit traps and spear traps and the like, but most of the tomb's traps aren't traps at all. They're just puzzles, and therefore they work very differently than traps. A few players out there have stated how the Tomb of Horrors didn't pose much of a challenge for them because they simply used a bunch of fine trap spells and breezed through the whole dungeon. Now, to me, that says one of two things. Either one, the Dungeon Master was nerfing it and sort of letting him have it through a simple spell, or two, everyone at the table doesn't really understand what a trap is and how a fine trap spell really works. Spells or abilities that detect physical or magical traps are detecting actual traps, such as pits or glyphs of warding or anything like that. They're not detecting anything that's just potentially harmful to the player characters, otherwise it'd work great at detecting poisons.
Or just go off around every single sharp object, like a dagger. It never knows if you're going to pick up that dagger and just jam it in your eye and ruin your day. Spells like fine traps do not take into account potential stupidity. And most of the puzzles inside the Tomb of Horrors are really only dangerous if you do something stupid.
Absolutely 100%. You can see he's about to go into the green devil mouth, which is an obvious thing too. 100%. If you're allowing the players to find a bunch of stuff with fine trap, then either you don't understand how the spell works, or you're nerfing the dungeon and making it easier for them. And the long and short of it is, when it comes down to it, this was one of the things that was a recurring theme going through it with XP to level 3. If you go into this tomb and you think about it as if you are the player and you have a vested interest in not losing a limb or being hurt, and you take your time and act with intentionality and think things through, a lot of times you avoid a lot of the problems, because the problems are not devious traps that have a high DC to find them. they're traps for the player, because if you don't think about your character as a real person and you do stupid video game stuff, you get stupid video game consequences. The big difference between the Tomb of Horrors and other Dungeons and Dragons modules is when you're doing it in a regular Dungeons and Dragons module, you fall in a pit trap, you take 2d6 damage, and you lose, on average, you lose 6 or 7 of your 35 or 45, or actually you're level 10. So you lose 6 or 7 of your, 50 or 60 hit points. But not in the Tomb of Horrors. In the Tomb of Horrors, you roll a save or you die. And that's if you're lucky enough for them to give you a save. So if you think about it that way and you just don't do stupid, rash things, a lot of times you can get through the tomb very well. And it's funny because I've actually used the Tomb of Horrors as a corporate team building exercise with people when I was training salespeople and doing some critical thinking training. I've actually used the Tomb of Horrors in that capacity, and not with Dungeons and Dragons character sheets, not with books. Very simply, a couple of 6-sided die and telling them what they're doing and how they're going to do it and letting them just ration through it. And people who've never played any of them, don't play video games, never thought about it, never played Dungeons and Dragons, didn't even realize they were playing a version of Dungeons and Dragons, would do better than people that I've taken through it who've been playing D&D at a table for 5 or 6 years. And the reason's because the people who are playing Dungeons and Dragons go into it with a Dungeons and Dragons mentality as if they're playing a game, and the people that were just a guy who was playing it because his boss said, hey, we're going to do this as a critical thinking experiment, as a fun distraction, as part of some training course we're going through, thought about it as, I'm a archaeologist who's exploring this old tomb, and I don't want to lose my hand, or he didn't know about hit points or anything.
For example, the iconic green devil face holds a fixed sphere of annihilation in its mouth. Stories abound out there about entire parties getting wiped out by this thing. First, from a fine trap spell's point of view, this isn't a trap. It's a sphere of annihilation. It's clearly there in front of the player characters, so the spell isn't going to assume that the caster is just dumb enough to stick their head inside of it. Also, while we're on the subject of the devil's face, how a sphere of annihilation works is that anything that goes inside of it is permanently annihilated. So if a player character was to, say, stick their hand inside of it, they're not going to feel anything because now there's nothing there in order for them to feel. And after a while, they're going to start feeling a bit dizzy because all the blood that was pumping into that hand is now just getting squirted inside the sphere and annihilated. But then when that player tries to remove their hand from the sphere, they're going to find out their arm just ends at exactly the point that their hand went inside the sphere. So this being said, if a player character was to, let's say, crawl headfirst into the sphere of annihilation, given my understanding of biology, once their head went enough into the sphere that it annihilated enough of their brain, they would just collapse and die. And all their player character friends, they're going to see their friend kind of start crawling into this devil face mouth, and all of a sudden their body drops. When they start trying to pull their buddy out, their buddy is going to end at exactly the point where their body entered the sphere. They're not just going to somehow keep crawling inside of it, even though their brain has been annihilated. So the whole concept that an entire party goes crawling in there one after another, and all oblivious and getting annihilated, and nobody knows how they died, that just simply isn't possible. So unless the player character was, let's say, like fly inside, be thrown inside, or power slide inside, they are going to die and stop moving inside long before they're completely annihilated. Other traps that aren't actually traps are the misty archways. We get a few of these in here, and they are all simply portals. They're just doing what they do, leading to where they lead. It's a player's fault if they simply walk through one of these portals without knowing where it goes. Think of an elevator. Imagine yourself, you're standing at the 50th story of a building, you're standing before the elevator doors, and they open up, and you can't see anything inside. It's either filled with mist or darkness or whatever, but you can't see anything beyond those doors. And then you just step through those doors, and you fall 50 stories down an empty elevator shaft to your death. That wasn't a trap. That was you just blindly stepping through that doorway like a fool without even confirming what was inside of it. A room with 3
There you go. Once again, don't do stupid stuff. If you opened a door and could not see anything in it, you're not just going to jump through it. But because it's a D&D character, I'll just jump through this misty archway and see what happens.
Open vats, one of acid, one of water, the third an ochre jelly. That's not a trap either. All of those things are clearly visible. It's the character's fault if they go start plunging their arms inside of them. Or the crown and the scepter. The crown can't come off of a player character's head until it touches one end of the scepter. The player character wearing the crown innately knows this, but they don't know which end of the scepter to touch against the crown. One of those is going to remove the crown safely, while the other one is going to entirely kill the player character. This is not a trap. This is simply a player character picking up an item that they're not familiar with and potentially using it incorrectly. It's like picking up a lightsaber by the wrong end. The same goes for sticking the wrong key in the wrong keyhole. The player characters have 2 keys and they have 2 keyholes. It's not a trap, it's just them figuring out which key to stick in which keyhole, because both keys will work in one keyhole, but one of them isn't going to work in the opposite keyhole. It's like jumping a car. You got 2 cables, one of them's got black, one of them's got red. Just stick them on the right things and it works. If you stick them on the wrong ones, you're going to have a problem. That doesn't make it a trap. I could go on and on, but the key point here is that while the Find Trap spell is going to certainly be very valuable and very useful inside the Tomb of Horrors because there are some very specific traps, Dungeon Masters need to understand what is and what is not a trap and what that spell is going to be useful for. Now
I get the feeling that old Seth shares some of my frustrations when it comes to people misinterpreting this adventure. Because to a man, every person I've ever met who hates this dungeon, who bashes this dungeon, who says it's garbage, or the people who say it's so easy and stuff, they all misinterpret so many things about it and don't understand it. Apparently, the trap part of it is a pet peeve for old Seth, because he went on for a good while there about why these people don't understand traps or how trap spells work. And he really touches on the big thing. Is that, like I said, the dungeon is a test for the player. It's not a test for the character. A character can roll a die to figure something out, can roll a die to find a trap, can cast a spell to find a trap. A player has to use their brain.
let's discuss some of the obstacles. Many of the obstacles might have trap elements or have traps involved, but for the trick is how the PCs are supposed to overcome them. For example, the complex of secret doors isn't about finding the doors. At their level, finding a secret door should be pretty easy for them to do. The trick is the player characters figuring out how to open each secret door. This isn't something that you should just give them because they found the secret door. You should actually make them role play out all the different ways that they try opening it, and not just rely on their dice, but actually have to figure it out. The pillared throne room, it says that touching a pillar intentionally or unintentionally will trigger the levitation effect.
One quick thing before he goes into this levitation effect. I touched on this in my last video. When it comes to the secret door complex, that is, you have to role play that out. And if I remember correctly, the module actually says you need to make them role play it out. There's a reason for that. It's because it is, like I said in that video, it primes the player, not the character, it primes the players for how they need to approach the rest of the dungeon. And if you don't give them that primer, you are setting them up for failure in later puzzles. For instance, one big thing is in the very final part, you have to turn the key 3 times to make the lock happen. And if you just gave them the secret doors, they don't think about things like, okay, we found the secret door, but we got to test it this way, test it that way. If they're used to testing those things, when they get that key, they're going to do stuff like, well, the key didn't work. Well, you know what? We had to do multiple things and play around with stuff earlier. So let's turn the key a couple of times. Let's try and turn the key backwards. Let's turn it to the right. Let's turn it to the left. Let's try to insert it backwards. Let's try and jiggle it. Let's try and turn it really fast. Let's try and turn it till it stops moving, whatever the case may be. But if you have allowed them to just have it because they found it and fast forwarded through the discovery process of their players figuring out how the doors work or how anything else works, you have robbed them of that critical thinking primer for the rest of the dungeon.
So my recommendation here is, unless the player specifically states that they're going to be avoiding any contact with these pillars, that they might have to make a dex check or something when they're passing through the room, just to make sure that their cloak or their sword that's hanging off their belt doesn't accidentally brush against one of these pillars and activate the effect.
And trust me, anybody that's worn a sword on their belt for any amount of time will tell you those things bump against everything.
Also, be very sure that you keep in mind what spells will and will not work against certain obstacles. For example, the room with the flying swords and the shields. While spells like Fireball might sound like they'd work great and just wipe them all out in one hit, the module clearly states that the only spells that will work against it are, and Fireball is not listed among them. Now let's discuss Skorkowski, the Demi-Leech, which he is the OG of. He is one of the hardest opponents in AD&D. Now initially that's not the case. Technically the player characters could enter his crypt, take any items they want and leave, and he isn't going to pay them any mind at all. But if they so much as touch the skull, that is when he is going to be bringing the pain raining down on them. Skorkowski has only a single attack. He steals the soul of the strongest party member, trapping it inside one of his gems. No save, it just happens unless the player characters make the proper countermeasures, which the module is extremely specific as to what those are. In fact, hurting the Demi-Leech at all is a bit strange, my favorite of those being that a thief can sling gems at him for 1 hit point for 10,000 gold pieces worth of value of the gem, which is so weirdly specific that I only wonder what Gygax's group was like. That way when he was writing the module, he was all like, haha, this sounds like something that they would try. Now,
to be honest with you, I thought about this for a while and I was like, no, this one makes sense because, again, if you approach this as if you yourself are personally in this situation, let's say you're naked because you stripped all your gear because you went through one of the Misty Archways. Here comes the Demi-Lich. It's going to start trying to trap everybody and that sort of thing. And what's one thing you might do if you're really in this situation? Well, you're in this room full of treasure. Maybe you start picking up rocks and throwing at them. And what kind of rocks are in that room? Gemstones. So you can accidentally figure that out by chucking diamonds at the dude. Now there's these specific things generally are the kind of stuff that's hinted at throughout the rest of the tome. And again, if you think about it as I'm a person in a real life scenario, as opposed to I'm a character in a game who has a certain meta, who has a certain design, who has a certain play style, some of these things make a lot more sense. Now, some of them are just random, like the whole Vorpal sword thing. There's no Vorpal sword in that treasure hoard. And if you don't have a Vorpal sword, it doesn't work. So some of that's just dumb luck, but some of it actually kind of makes sense as a person. This is also part of the reason why I'm a big advocate of the DM should roll up player characters for this dungeon. Don't bring your own character. Don't write your own person. Hand out the character sheets at the beginning of it and have some of this stuff in there.
Later versions of the Demi-Lich, starting with the AD&D Monster Manual 2 all the way through the current edition, give different powers and different weaknesses that Demi-Liches have. But for Skorkowski, I would go ahead and do him exactly the way that he is presented in the module as is. After all, he was the first appearance of this type of monster.
I agree with this too. You shouldn't change Skorkowski at all. But not because of him being quote unquote a Demi-Lich. Skorkowski, just like the rest of the dungeon, is a puzzle to challenge the player, not necessarily to challenge the characters. So don't allow them to fall back on game rule information and character information to get an easy win out of it, or not even necessarily an easy win, but to make things less difficult than they should be. Make them think.
However, don't limit yourself to the only things that are on that list or the only things that can kill a Skorkowski. If your players try something kind of creative and crazy and maybe something that's going to cost them quite a bit of treasure, such as hurling 10,000 gold piece gems against it to see if that'll work, I say go ahead and let them have it if you think that's good enough. So, such as if the skull lifts up and a player character dives forward with a bag of holding and they grab the skull inside the bag, and now it's trapped inside the pocket dimension inside the bag of holding, and they charge charge through the Tomb of Horrors and they hurl the bag, skull and all, into the Sphere of Annihilation, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and give them that. That was a creative use of the bag of holding in the Sphere of Annihilation. Now, of course, any souls that were trapped inside the gems and the eyes and teeth, those are now lost forever. But hey, a win is a win, and you can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. You said earlier not to change anything. Keep it all pure as Gygax intended as some such.
I did, but I'm more of a spirit of the law versus a letter of a law sort of game master, and I feel that Gygax's Tomb is completely about rewarding players being creative and doing smart decisions and just punishing foolish decisions. So if a player has come up with something that's really creative and not just them trying to exploit some sort of loophole or becoming dependent on a specific spell or anything like that, I think Gygax would have rewarded them for that, so therefore I'm going to reward them for that. But I think this is something that shouldn't be given to the player characters as a freebie. It's something that should be earned if you're going to change anything about the adventure just because they were extremely creative.
All right, so I agree with this in part. I agree with the spirit of it. I think he's absolutely right. It's about rewarding good decisions and clever solutions, and it's about punishing bad decisions. I agree wholeheartedly about, like, hey, more credence should be given as a game master to something they come up with if it's not trying to exploit some piece of game rule information or some particular spell or some nonsense like that, that it really should be a situation where some cleverness should be awarded. The example he gave about the bag of holding and stuff, I'd give that to a player too. But you got to be careful with that. One, it has to be something that is a challenge to the player, not a challenge to the character. And it really needs to be way outside of the box and make a tremendous amount of sense. It can't just be, instead of hurling gems that are worth a lot of money at him, you hurl money at him. It can't be just you hurl anything that's worth that, or you throw magic items at him that are worth large amounts of money. It has to be the gemstones. It doesn't need to be something that's simple. It needs to be something that's extremely creative, such as throwing a portable hole over them or breaking a staff of the Magi over its head. You get the two pieces of the staff of the Magi that are in the previous sarcophagus. Maybe they're like, hey, what we're going to do is we're going to throw him and the broken staff of the Magi and the bag of holding, or we're going to punch holes in it or something like that to try and make him fall out of the pocket dimension. It needs to be something along those lines that's very creative and makes sense. Not make sense within the game rules, but makes sense within kind of the quote unquote real world where the players are reading between the lines.
Also, because the things that affect Acererak are so very specific, and a lot of players are never ever going to think of those, I recommend that if they research him before they go inside the Tomb of Horrors, they do legend lore or anything like that, go ahead and give them some sort of hint as a reward for doing their due diligence beforehand. It could be something small, such as he is susceptible to forget spells or something like that. But if they're going to research him before they go inside, they should get some sort of reward for that. Now, characters are
all right, I don't agree with that at all. This should not be. First off, like I said, I don't really agree with running this as like part of a campaign or with any kind of preface to it. To me, it's a, hey, here's your character sheet. We're doing the Tomb of Horrors. You're starting on the side of the cliff. There's the tomb. Go after it, and running it exactly as the 12 pages of the module tell you to run it. But even that said, I don't think you should get a whole bunch of additional hints and stuff like that when it comes to Acererak. That, to me, goes back to what I said before. That is rolling on a character sheet and using stat blocks to get an advantage over the tomb. It's a challenge to the player, not to the character. So you should not be using, I used bardic knowledge or some nonsense like that, legend lore, whatever, and now I've got hints on how to beat it. That's not how the tomb should work, in my opinion. It's not the worst thing in the world, but at the same time, like if you were going to do, like I said in the previous video, and use this as some kind of like dream sequence type deal, maybe. But to me, no, I'm going to disagree there.
go inside the tomb are going to be doing so at great risk. And the module suggests that players of small groups might handle 2 characters at a time. And if they don't want to risk their own player characters, we've got some, or they don't have any spare ones, we've got 20 pre-generated characters complete with lists of magical equipment. However, if you notice, none of that listed equipment includes +4 or 5 weapons, vorpal blades, or swords of sharpness, which are specifically listed as some of the only things that can harm the main villain. That is some bull crap that they're not in there. So Dungeon Masters, if you're going to be using any sort of pre-generated characters, make sure that that group has at least 1 or 2 weapons that can possibly affect the bad guy. Otherwise, you're setting them up for failure, and that is a dick move. Also, while we're on the subject of those lists of gear and equipment, here's another suggestion I have of a way you could use those. There are several spots inside the Tomb of Horrors where a player character might be stripped of all of their items and then kind of be spat naked outside of the tomb. Now, they might have a cache of some extra equipment or stuff like that outside, or they might have to go back to their stronghold or wherever and pick up some backup gear that they have, but maybe they don't have any backup gear, they don't have any backup gear anywhere nearby, and you want to get back to the game. The last time that I ran this adventure, I had this old hermit that was wandering around the swamp that was around the Tomb of Horrors, and the player characters met him before he went in, and he told him some fun little information, and that old hermit was actually a polymorph silver dragon who was kind of overseeing the land and was hoping to get the Lich destroyed. So when the player characters emerge from the tomb completely naked, he then kind of said, hey, I got something to show you. And he takes them out and he shows them a couple different graves that are buried throughout the swamp. And he explains that these are the bodies of different heroes that had previously gone inside the Tomb of Horrors and died, and their comrades dragged their bodies outside and buried them at different places throughout the swamp. And the hermit's philosophy here is that it would bring peace to their souls if those dead people's equipment was then used to destroy the Lich that killed them. So that way we could resupply the characters and get them back inside. So you could consider that as just an idea to use in case your player characters get stripped of all their gear, but they do want to keep going. This is a quick and easy method to get them some stuff.
Okay. So I agree with the very first point. If you were going to do pre-generated characters, which I do recommend, there should be a chance that they get some items that they can use to, say, defeat a Surak. Now, what that should be is like, hey, I've got 9 or 10 characters drawn up. What do you want to play? Oh, I want to play fighter. Cool. The fighter has a keen or a sword of sharpness, keen sword or sword of sharpness, depending on what edition you're running. Maybe a vorpal weapon. Maybe this dwarf has a warhammer that's +4. But if they're like, oh yeah, well, I'm going to play the rogue, well, maybe you just didn't pick the character class that would have that particular item. You know, if you have a wizard, make sure that his spell book includes those spells. Don't say this is what you have prepared. Say, here's what you know here's your known spells that are in your spell book. You tell me what you have prepared. You don't pick out which one they need to, prepare for them, but you give them the chance. As for the items, as for the whole, like the silver dragon that brings you to the graves and stuff, I'm going to go ahead and disagree on that. I have done that in the past, or done something similar in the past. Done the whole, you can run back to town and get it on credit, or the other players front you the money so that you can buy some mundane gear so that at least you're not naked anymore. But remember that throughout the tomb, there are very, very few situations where you actually are entering combat. Very, very few things. And a lot of the monsters are going to kill you outright anyway. There's very few places where you're going to fight and it's going to matter, or where you're going to fight and there's not an easy way for you to escape. So, for instance, the swords and shields, if you step out of the room they're in, they stop coming after you. They don't chase you. The Mummy Lord only happens if you screw around and take the ring in there. The Juggernaut just kills you. There's no way to fight it. There's only really 2 situations very, very early in the dungeon where you're actually going to have to fight monsters. So for the most part, you don't really need a lot of your gear other than like the gem of seeing that you can find in the tomb itself. So I say let them go through naked. It's like, well, they might need that thing. What if it's the fighter who has the Vorpal sword or the keen sword or the sword of sharpness or whatever that's needed to fight a Surak? Well, when you walk into the treasure room, all your gear is right there. So you don't have to fight the ghost or the Demi-Lich without your gear. It's right there in the room. Now, if you're dumb enough that you don't put your gear on first and say, hey, man, I got my stuff back, before you start scooping up treasure and grabbing hold of, jeweled skulls and stuff, that's on you. But your gear is right there, so there's no need to re-equip the party.
Okay, guys, I am wearing a dead man's clothes and using his stuff. Let's go back inside for round 2. This time it's for revenge and to get our crap back.
Now, let's get back to those demons. As we established earlier, there are some demons lurking around the Tomb of Horrors, enough to spot an astral ethereal character 1 in 6 rounds. Now, the question really is, what are they doing here? At least that was the question that I asked when I read about that. And the answer that I came up with, or the best answer that I came up with, is that they are here maintaining and repairing the Tomb of Horrors. The tomb has been here a very long time. It's got a big skull on the top of it that's announcing its presence, but there's remarkably very little evidence of other parties that have gone through here before. We do have a few skeletons here and there that are all in dramatically appropriate places, but those are all staged. Those are intentional window dressing by a Sararak. And the only one of those that might not actually be window dressing is the group of people around the glowing gym, but we can just assume that those were the last party that had gone here before, and the demons haven't gone around to cleaning that up yet. We have an idea of how many victims have died inside the Tomb of Horrors in the spot with the mithril valves. If we cut these valves, they begin to spill the blood of all of those who have died inside the tomb, filling the foyer to the ceiling in about 20 rounds. The ceiling to the foyer is over 20 feet high. We know that because the doors themselves are being described as 28 feet tall, and the area of the room is 500 square feet. But we're just going to go by 20 feet high just for the sake of this example, because I don't want to then take out space for the stairs or anything. So all the numbers we're going to give are going to be severely lowballed, so we're just going to use 20 feet. We're going to do some dirty math.
Oh, it is some dirty, dirty math.
500 square feet at 20 feet high comes to 10,000 cubic feet. Converting that to liters gives us 280,000 liters. The average human body holds 5.5 liters of blood. So with a little division, the blood of all of those who have died inside the Tomb of Horrors comes to over 56,000 people. Now, we can just go ahead and say that 30,000 of those people were among the craftsmen and the artisans who built the original tomb, and then a Sararak brutally murdered and sacrificed them in order to harness the power and make sure that nobody could tell the secrets of the tomb. So even if we took out 30,000 people, that still leaves us with 26,000 victims that the tomb has consumed since then. Now, I don't know how long the tomb has been there. Some later adventures say that the tomb's been there for 800 years, but the original module doesn't specify. So even if we say it's been there for 1,000 years, that still means that with 26,000 people, 26 people die inside the Tomb of Horrors every single year. That is a party or two, and saying that this place has had a lot of traffic. Yet, all of the traps are still perfectly armed. There is not really any sign of their passing, notes scrawled into walls and spikes hammered into place with bits of rope hanging off of them like that. Nothing says that a stadium's worth of people have passed through this tomb and have died inside of it. The solution is that somebody is clearly cleaning up the Tomb of Horrors, removing any of the spikes, remortaring up any portions of the walls, and disposing of the bodies either by dissolving them in acid or chucking them through the mouth of the green devil face, kind of like a giant garbage chute. And what they're not fixing is just being regenerated by the tomb, because the tomb itself is the actual body of a Sararak the Demi-Lich, and he is just feeding off of the life essence of all the dead heroes who come inside. And once those heroes do come inside and die, he and his demon minions then, clean it up, fix any evidence like that, and reset the trap, because it's pretty much just like a giant undead Venus flytrap. To me, this adds a whole new level of creepiness to the Tomb of Horrors. Like maybe the player characters that go inside and maybe they get defeated or they realize they're not ready yet and they go out and they reprovision up and they come back. But then when they come back, they can see that certain things about the tomb have sort of repaired and fixed themselves because it's just been regenerating in the time that they were gone and getting more stuff. And that adds a whole cool level of creepiness about it. Anyway, this video has gone on long enough. So in conclusion, Tomb of Horrors is a hard scenario. It is meant to be a hard scenario. Every inch of this dungeon is designed to defeat characters, and it rewards players who play like high-level players and punishes those who slack off for even a second. This scenario is in a unique position as a module because it is unlike any other module out there because of the reputation that it's earned from it. Players should know what they're going into before they go inside the Tomb of Horrors. This is Gygax's ultimate test. It's not for everyone, and not even most players should play the Tomb of Horrors, because the goal of this adventure isn't necessarily, winning it or beating it or killing the bad guy. It's really just seeing how well you can do against it. Dungeon masters really need to prepare all their notes beforehand, make sure they have a full understanding of all the different parts of the tomb. That way they can run this smoothly and run this like an honest referee. But they definitely need to be honest with themselves if they think that their players will even enjoy the Tomb of Horrors. Make sure that the players are appropriate for this type of adventure. And if they're not, don't run them through the Tomb of Horrors. Run them through many of the other scenarios that are out there. But if they are appropriate for the Tomb of Horrors, if you think that this is something that they would enjoy, then definitely run them through it and have fun.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please.
Okay, so a lot of good there. Now, I am going to call a little bit on this. He kind of pitched the whole, the demons come in and clean up the tomb and reset the traps and stuff as kind of his own idea. Maybe it was. Let's give him the benefit of the doubt. I think Seth puts out really good content and is generally an honest YouTuber. But, I mean, in the 3.5 edition version, it literally says that that's what the demons are there for. I'll have to read through S1 again to see if it says it in the original. But I know in the 3.5 version, it literally says that that's what's happening is the demons come in and clean up and reset everything. I think it actually even has a time frame in it. Like if you go out and you take a full rest, like if you sleep overnight, what 5th edition would call a long rest, it resets everything. So, like I said, I'm going to kind of give him there's a little bit of a rib there that's like, hey, it ain't really how you do it. That's kind of how the module's done it since probably 2nd edition. But everything else there is true. This is a player test. And your characters don't matter near as much as your players on this. Like you said as well, you need to know your players. There's going to be some players that this is just not appropriate for. And you're not going to enjoy it as a dungeon master, and they're not going to enjoy it as a player, to be perfectly honest. So, with all that said, at the end of the day, the Tomb is, in my opinion, one of the best. And I've kind of started making a Tomb of Horror series here. I might even make one more reaction related to the Tomb to a different channel. You let me know if you want to see that down below. But this adventure is important to me, and I think it's important to the hobby. I think that this is something that, whether you're a Dungeons and Dragons player or not, you should have some experience with at some point in your gaming career. Game masters, take S1, adapt it to Traveler, adapt it to Cyberpunk, adapt it to Call of Cthulhu, adapt it to whatever game you're playing, and run it. Run it with the players knowing exactly what it's supposed to be. Because this is, like I said, a test for players. But that's all I got to say on this for right now. If you think that I should do some more Tomb of Horrors related reactions, maybe 1 or 2 more, let me know in the comment section below. Otherwise, like, share, and subscribe. I'll see you guys next time when I'm probably going to go back to XP for level 3. And one of his regular gaming videos to see if there's one of them that I might find something to agree with or some amusement out of, some merit to, or let me know. I will see you guys next time.